Brilliant. All right. So my name is Heather Flanagan. I'm the Acting Executive Director for CIDPRO, and here with me today is Kevin Streeter, the Chair of our Certification Committee, and Hannah Suter, one of our board members who's been particularly passionate about the CIDPRO exam. Many of you have had, questions about, all right, what's it like? What do I need to know? How hard is it? How long is it going to take? There's, questions because many of us perhaps thought that when we finished university, we were done with all of that. But no, there's still more tests to take in life. And Kevin is here to basically help you think about how to prepare for something like the CIDPRO exam. With that, I'm just going to go hand straight over to Kevin.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather, and very good to be here with everyone. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm based in the UK, but I've been involved in the CIDPRO certification project since the beginning, and really good to be here to present the certification preparation webinar. Second time that I've done this. The first time was at Identiverse back in May, and went very well at Identiverse. So hopefully today you'll be able to take something away from this webinar and feel more prepared for taking the CIDPRO exam. So with that, let's kick off. So CIDPRO, its mission is to globally foster ethics and excellence in the practice of and profession of digital identity. One of the best ways to do this is to put in place some really solid learning and certification programs. So that mission has led us to creating the CIDPRO credential. So what I'm going to go through today is really what is CIDPRO, some of the basics of the exam, some of the preparation that you should be looking at, and then into the exam itself with what's the structure, what are some of the key themes and references you should be looking at, a bit on the content itself, and we're going to finish with a couple of sample questions and be looking to get some input through some of these later stages to see how your learning's going. So let's start with just a brief introduction to the CIDPRO credential. So talked about CIDPRO being a great place for identity professionals to learn, share and grow. Launching a foundational certification program is absolutely central to the mission. But one of the most important things is that this is a rigorous but vendor neutral certification. Myself, I come from the vendor world and been doing that, and every vendor has their own product specific certifications. But what we need in the identity space is a vendor neutral certification that covers all of the core elements of identity and access management. And that's what we've been able to put together for this credential. And it's not going to be just one exam. This is the foundation. This covers all of the essential knowledge that you need to know. And we have a longer term plan to build on this, to go into specialized industries, to go into much deeper areas. So things like healthcare and all the requirements that come into that, for example. But this is the starting point, and hopefully the CIDPRO exam as it stands at the moment is going to be a really good representation of professionalism of identity. I'm going to start with the most important thing through our entire development process was the top statement here. This credential is designed for people who are working in identity as identity professionals with ideally at least 2 years experience. We're looking for people that know a little more than just the technical foundations. We want you to know what it actually looks like to be involved actively in building, running, maintaining identity systems. So we're expecting a degree of practical experience. So this is not one of those credentials that you do a course, you read a book, and you take the exam and you've got it. There is a place for those, but that's not what we're trying to achieve with CIDPRO. We're looking to validate real world experience. So this 2 years of experience is absolutely central. So it's there to be able to validate your experience, fill gaps. People have areas of identity that they're not as in depth with, and this credential allows you to explore those and get to know which areas you want to know a bit more about, so that you can become a fully rounded identity professional. It can give you credibility, enhance your employability, and give some demonstration that you're continually learning. As I said, CIDPRO is industry sector agnostic and vendor neutral, and it's relevant to a whole range of different roles in the identity world. You could be everything from security architect, coder, consultant, or a deep identity specialist. The credential will be relevant for all of those roles. As I said, it's a foundational credential to represent that you're experienced enough in identity to be a competent professional in identity and access management. So let's go on to the basics of the exam. Now, these are the real practical things you just need to know about. The exam itself consists of 100 multiple choice questions. Each question has one single correct answer. You can mark a question, say, I need to come back to this for a review later, and you have 180 minutes to answer the question. If English is not your first language, then you can ask for what's called an accommodation that allows the test to run for a longer period so that you've got more time to read and understand the questions. If you do need that accommodation, then please contact the certification alias at CIDPRO, and they can set up the additional time for you. In terms of taking the test, you can attend a live testing session, such as the one I ran at Identiverse. You can take the test at a location of your choice, which is called remote proctoring. If you do that, you'll need to install a secure lockdown browser. It's called Respondus. It's built specifically for this type of online remote proctoring. Obviously, if you've got very secure systems, then you may need to find another system that you can use with Respondus. Most people can download and install it. It's a very lightweight, secure browser, but obviously be aware of that before you try and take the test. But if you're doing it remotely, you will need to install the Respondus browser. The test itself, it's called the cut score, but the passing grade of the exam is 64. That means 64 questions out of the 100 presented. It's built using a thing called the Angoff process. So it's not strictly a sort of pass score, but it's the number of questions you need to get answered in order to meet what is called the minimally competent candidate standard. So once you pass this, you have reached that minimal competence in identity as far as the group of people who built the exam were concerned. It's a very useful way of just being able to say, okay, I've reached this status. Anything you get over 64 is obviously showing greater competence than the minimum. We give you a breakdown of the results according to the sections, the objective sections. We don't give you the results per question. So we're trying to give you some feedback at the end of the exam, but we don't want to give you all the detail because obviously we've got a limited number of questions in the item bank. If you're successful, you'll be sent an email with instructions so that you can claim your digital credential from Credly. And at this time, the credential does not expire, and there are no continuing education requirements. I know there's a number of certifications in the industry more broadly, particularly some of the security certifications where they've got a very high requirement for CPD, and they expire after 2 or 3 years. That isn't the case with the CIDPRO exam, and One of the reasons is that it's a foundational exam. We want to make sure that we're demonstrating a level of foundational competence. We're not going to expire that. Once you've reached that level, you've got it for good. So it doesn't expire in the way that many do. So how do you prepare for the CIDPRO exam? 3 main steps for preparation. The first is to really understand the foundational knowledge, and the core resource for this is the CIDPRO body of knowledge. Great reference, lots of really useful articles, very specific to the exam questions, but also great body of knowledge just to read to understand identity. We are expecting some applied experience, so some workplace experience, so that you know you've actually been able to apply that knowledge and you've got some experience of what it looks like for real running an identity system. And then you need to go into the exam preparation. So that's where we have the practice exam, where we want to help you to get ready, and sessions like this. When you've got all of that, hopefully you'll be successful and you will achieve the CIDPRO certified foundation level exam. So these steps: review the body of knowledge, have a look at the CIDPRO reference guide on the website. So we have a reference guide, we have the objectives all listed on the CIDPRO website. Go and make sure you're fully orientated to what is in the exam and what the references are. The reference guide is there to point you at the right articles and the right documents to start having a look at. Gain some experience as an identity practitioner, and then go through, do the practice exam, review your gaps, maybe do a bit of extra learning, and then you should be ready to take the exam. And these are just the documents I was talking about on the CIDPRO website. There's a section for CIDPRO. If you go to CIDPRO, you'll find the reference resources and the objectives and topics associated. So, structure of the exam. The exam started from the body of knowledge, which is why I'm suggesting that's a very good reference source. Then we went through a process of what we call knowledge area abstraction, identifying the key topics, the key standards, everything that's relevant for this credential. And that led us to create the exam blueprint. Once we've got the exam blueprint, we've then got a template that says what should the exam questions be asking about. One of the good things about this process is that reveals some gaps in the body of knowledge. So there are some areas of identity that are still very limited in their documentation. So I've been able to identify that. There are some new articles that have been written, and eventually we will go back around this cycle again to update the exam. So it's a continual process of development. At this point, we've done one cycle, but as new areas of identity are developed, then we will go back around it and update the exam so that it's always kept in step with the technology in the industry. I just want to say a little bit about the rigor in creating the exam. The item writers didn't just randomly sit down and write a question. It's quite a structured process where we had a number of information sessions. We went through item writers selection. These were all people that had the minimum requirements. Many of them are leaders in the identity industry. They then went through a number of structured training programs to make sure they knew how to write questions in a fair and balanced way. The writing took place, and then there was quite a long cycle of post-item review. So every question that's presented in the exam has been through a group of identity professionals to check that it's fair, to check that it's accurate, and to check that we're not trying to catch anybody out. It's something that's often said about certification exams is surely the exam writers are trying to trick us, and there are things in there that we just didn't know about. In reality, when you're building an industry credential like this, you have to make sure it is fair and balanced for everybody. So the review process does that. We also follow that with a beta program. So the exam's been tested by, in this case, 50 people who took the exam. We looked at the feedback, took out any questions that didn't seem to provide the right answers or weren't fair. So you can be assured that the content of the exam itself is pretty solid. It's been very well reviewed, and the questions are there to just assess your abilities. They're not there. There's no items in there that are just there to try and catch you. It genuinely is a fair set of exam questions. For the balance of the exam, we've got 5 objectives. Hopefully you've seen these objectives on the website or through looking at the exam. This is the weighting of the objectives, and that's quite important when you're thinking about where do you spend your time in preparing. The largest area of questioning is around the basic elements of an identity solution. So you can see that 28% of the questions in the item bank and in the final paper are around these basic components. Do you know what an IDP is, for example? Do you know what it does? Real basic in foundational elements. Second most important is security for identity. So there's quite a lot in there about just the security, the things that you need to be aware of. 24% is still quite a high percentage of the exam. And then one that really causes a problems for people is the operational considerations. What is it like when you're running an identity system for real in practice? What are the issues that come up? What are the things you need to think about? Where might you get a breach in security because of just a paper-based or a human-driven process? So that's also tested, and it's an area where, particularly if people have come from a technical background, it can sometimes cause some gaps. So it's an important area to spend some time looking at. The other 2 areas are much lower. So around identifiers, the identity lifecycle, identity proofing, and the rules and standards. Still very important. We've got in there a lot of key things, particularly proofing. Really important to understand what's going on there, what's going on with identifiers, and what's going on with standards. These could be very generic, broad standards, or things like GDPR, for example. We have questions around that and how it's implemented in different places. So this is the balance. Hopefully this gives you some guidance as to where you should put your focus when you're doing your preparation. The second dimension about each question is rated for its difficulty. This is to make sure that across the exam, it's fair. We're not trying to apply questions that are just going to be constantly high level evaluation type questions. We've got to have a balance of basic knowledge. So that's your first level with knowledge and comprehension. A range of application and analysis questions, which is really checking on your experience. And then the third cognitive level is around synthesis and evaluation, where we're trying to ask you to draw topics from different areas in order to evaluate a situation. There are very few of those third type of questions on the paper. there are some, and we need to have them there to make sure that if somebody is a real, a true leader and advocate of identity, there are still some challenging questions so they can get a really high percentage on the paper, but it isn't the core of the exam. Majority of the exam are level 1, level 2. We're looking for knowledge and we're looking for the ability to apply it. So there are a few quick advanced questions, but as you go through the exam paper, you'll see there's only 2 or 3 in every paper that we present. So you're not going to get a constant list of really complex questions. So what are the main themes and some of the references? So you'll find a lot of this in the reference document. That's where I took most of this from. But there's a key topic all the way through the exam on assurance. And obviously, these are some of the key documents that relate to that. So they're good documents to take a look at. NIST is going to appear constantly on this list. The NIST special publications, take a look at some of these. These are going to give you a lot of guidance on the assurance area. As you'd expect with an identity and access management exam, there's going to be a lot on authentication. This is not an exhaustive list, but here are some of the key things you would expect to be questioned on as you go through the exam. Again, a lot of NIST documents, some standards documents, but also being aware of things, particularly as you can see at the end about biometric data and identity verification. Authentication really is a core theme right the way through. You need to make sure that you're familiar with a lot of these documents. Authorization, particularly OAuth 2, knowing that there are, again, quite a few questions around this. Just understanding where authorization fits alongside authentication, the differences, the different protocols, the application, all key parts of the exam. Federation. Okay, it's exactly what you'd expect to see in a foundation exam for identity. OpenID Connect, very important. The NIST documents, again, going to be very important. And obviously SAML is going to be in that mix. So we're not going into the detail of these standards. It's the function of them. It's where do you use them? How do they fit into an identity infrastructure? So keep that in mind. We're not asking you questions about the details of how SAML or IDC work, but you really need to know the application. Reasonable number on life cycle. So where does life cycle management fit? Where does SCIM fit? Just general identity proofing, but getting to understand the identity life cycle, because again, it's a given in the identity world. We are going to be asking you about identity life cycle. And some general documents, particularly from NIST and from ISO. There's a lot of core concepts, and I think one of the things we had to do in writing the exam was make it vendor independent, make it generic. Everyone uses slightly different language for the same things, but if we go back to some of the core documentation, particularly the NIST documents, you find the definitions. In a few places we've had to come up with our own definitions, but in general, wherever we can, we follow the terminology that comes from the standards and particularly from the NIST publications. So being familiar with NIST is important, particularly around identity. Make sure you're aware and you've at least had a read through the introductions, because we are sourcing questions from documents like this. So the 863.3 series, just identity guidelines, enrollment, identity proofing, authentication, federation, assertions. These are your core sources. If there's one thing to read before going into the exam as part of your preparation, it's to spend a bit of time reading through the NIST special publications. So we're now going to come on to a short session on the exam content, and then we'll have a look at a few questions. And this is where I'd like to try and introduce a little bit of interaction if we can. So objective 1 is about explaining the basics of an identity solution. These are the components. They're laid out in the objective specification. We want you to explain identity system components, architectural patterns, what are some of the requirements, the difference between the management of non-human and human identities is very important, and the implications of privacy, ethics, and bias in solutions. So I'm going to open up the chat and say, could you possibly just put a few suggestions as to what type of questions you think might be asked under this? If somebody wants to, a few of you would like to throw out some suggestions, what do you think we might be asking under these objectives?
While folks are thinking about that and dropping their their proposed questions in the document, we did have one question about whether there's been an analysis on how well the practice exam predicts success in the real exam.
We haven't. We've not done the detailed analysis. We've done a light touch analysis so far. What I'm seeing so far is it is a good predictor. It's intentionally selected questions from all 5 of the objectives, and it's being answered pretty much in line with the exam. We have to wait until we've got a certain number of people who have actually attempted the practice exam to do a detailed analysis. We have now reached that threshold, so it's something I want to have a look at and make sure that it is acting as a good reflection of the real exam. From the selection of questions that were chosen, I would say it's very representative, but we've not done that analysis piece. Just having a look at the other question. Can we get the box? Okay, I'm going to come on to some of that in a second. Okay. I'm not seeing anyone put any suggestions in. Okay, let's have a look. This is, for me, these are 2 of the key articles in the book that relate to objective 1. Sometimes the title doesn't completely align, but if you were to have a look at these 2 articles, they will give you a very good foundation for objective 1, particularly the administrative topics, the core components of an identity solution. So I don't know, William, if this is what you were asking for, but for objective 1, this is the best place to start, is by having a look at these 2 documents. And okay.
But there are 30 over BOK articles, right? It's not just those 2, isn't it?
It's not just these 2. No, these are the 2 foundational articles that you should read. But as I said in the previous section, all those other resources are sources that have been used. There is no one single source, but every question has got an authoritative source behind it. So it may be one of the NIST documents, it may be a BOK article, but what we're trying to question on is your breadth of knowledge of the identity space. It's not a book test. So these are your 2 starting points as far as the BOK is concerned. but it's not everything you need to know. If you want to cover everything in Objective 1, you need to have a look at all those other resources as well. So that's the balance. I'm trying to give you some steer as to where should you start, but also where should you go later on. So these are the two core documents for Objective 1. Okay, Objective 2 very much identifiers, identity lifecycle, identity proofing. Identity proofing is quite a big area in here. Again, if you think of this topic, you've really got to think about what is an identity itself. What do we mean by an identity? Again, if you want to throw something into the chat, please do. But these are really understanding the role of a digital identity in the identity lifecycle. The key documents for this, well, there's two in the book. The overview of digital identity lifecycle is very relevant for this, and the article on identifiers and usernames. These two pretty much cover what's in Objective 2 really nicely. Understanding what do we really mean by an identifier? What do we mean by the lifecycle? What's relevant as an identifier? There are a few questions in here around making sure that you're using identifiers that are unique, global, non-discriminatory, just using relevant identifiers in systems so that it's going to be an identity system that is future-proofed and relevant at all times. So these are the two BOK articles that are really relevant to the second objective. Objective 3, core concepts of security. This is where we're really trying to get into some of the sort of the more detailed cryptographic elements, but actually understanding the principles of how is the security implemented. So what are the core concepts of authentication? What are the core concepts of authorization? You need to know PKI. You need to know how does public key work to be able to answer some of these questions. But you also need to be very aware of what are the common exploits? How are these vulnerable? Where do threats potentially come from? So it's very much around the core components of an identity solution as implemented. Where does it get its security from? Where might it be vulnerable? How might it be exploited? Because those are very much operational elements of identity solutions. Again, the BOK has a couple of key articles that are very relevant to this. The introduction to access control and the introduction to access management. So these cover the security topics, or sort of give you the foundational elements that you need to know. Along with all the other BOK articles, if you've read these articles and you really understand them and you know how they're applied, it's giving you a very good steer as to what the other questions will be asking you, because these are the foundational BOK components we've worked from. To get a range of questions, this is where we've had to go to the other documentation, so that we don't just ask questions that are straight out of the BOK, we're asking you a whole range of questions in the same discipline. Objective 4 is really where we've put the legal elements and the standards. So there's a lot of standards organizations around that relate to identity. You've got everything from ISO, you've got all the GDPR requirements, different states implementing different privacy rules. lots of things that relate to the identity landscape and to the legal aspects of identity. So in here, you'll find a lot of questions that are around compliance. This is probably the lowest performing area in terms of people getting questions correct, mainly because certainly GDPR and segmenting data and just the policies around that are not things that are every day for everybody. We still need to ask about them on the exam. So it's topics that are very relevant in this area. I'm just going to come to a question you just asked, William, about do you need to know about ISO? You need to know about ISO. You don't need to know the stat. You don't need a copy of the standard. So you need to be aware of the ISO standards, what they cover, but at a level of reading the book. We're not asking detailed questions about exactly what's inside the ISO documents. Every question is backed by an accessible resource. So things like the NIST documents are available to everybody. So those are fair documents to use. We've avoided using specifics from ISO standards because they are not accessible to everybody without payment. But we do make reference to them in some of the questions in Objective 4. And as you can see, here are some of the key resources. The laws governing identity systems, there's a good BOK article around that. The ISO documents, 24760, you'll find some articles in the BOK around those, and same for an introduction to GDPR. There's sufficient in these BOK articles to be able to answer the questions that are coming up. So again, then we're not trying to ask you something that you can't read. You can't find an article to read up on, but when it comes to ISO, you'll see a lot of it's already covered in the BOK articles. And Objective 5, the operational side, the customer service considerations, is something that does catch people because they've not really thought about how even a simple scenario like a operations center for customer service, you can inadvertently end up with man-in-the-middle attacks. You can inadvertently introduce vulnerabilities. So how do you manage a secure identity solution in an operational environment where you've got to think about how the users of the system and the support people supporting the system are going to be behaving? You've got to think about just privilege management, the strategies, privacy requirements, not sharing data that you shouldn't be sharing. So a lot of these practical operational aspects, really important to the running of identity in practice, not as commonly covered in a lot of training programs. Or this really comes from experience of using identity for real. So again, really key topics, a number of questions here. It is one of the lower areas of being asked questions on, but it's still very important. And 2 articles that relate to this. So the article on GDPR, very relevant, and privacy and compliance for consumers, again, another article that's very important. So hopefully in this section, I'm giving you some steer to specific BOK articles that are really important to know, to fully understand before you go into the exam, because a lot of the foundational questions have been based on the content of these articles. As I said, they are expanded upon by using other resources, but if you know this set of mock articles, then you've got a really good foundation for your preparation. So finally, before we go into the Q&A, I'm just going to try out a couple of sample questions and see how this goes. So if everyone on the call would like to take a look at this question and put into the chat what you think the correct answer is. And this is where I see if you've all stayed awake so far. Okay, we've got one, we've got a B, we've got a B. We've got a B. Yeah, and B. Okay, we've got a pretty good consensus here. Correct answer is B. Yeah. This is what a question looks like. This is from the GDPR section of the exam. Quite a number of people have struggled with this in the past because they've not been fluent in GDPR and how it's implemented and how it's been implemented. There are principles in GDPR that are then implemented in either country or state legislation. But the principles apply everywhere, and that's what we're asking in this question. So yes, everyone's got this right. B is good answer for the right answer for this. Okay, so this is an example of a scenario-based question. What do you think the answer is to this one? Oh, we've got some differences. And any more? Okay, mostly A. Yeah. Correct answer is A. Yeah. It's a good example of a question that you've got to make a little bit of a judgment call. There is some rationale to say B is possibly worth considering, but no, A is the reason that you would do privileged access management. But some of those answers, you see, the distractors are there to just throw out some questioning as to whether the answer you've selected, you just instinctively know is the right answer. Is the right answer. It's trying to throw you off a little bit. This is a fair approach to asking a question to determine if you actually know this subject or not. So yeah, in this case, A is the right answer. And the last one on cryptography. Okay. Okay, we've got an A, another A, A. Yeah. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of A's come through on this. Correct answer is A. Yeah. So these are three samples of questions that are on the practice exam. There are very similar questions in the live papers, but a couple of different styles of questioning here. So you've got scenario, You've got a benefit question. So this is a good example of saying, okay, what's the benefit of? It's still a choice you've got to make. It's not necessarily a technical choice. It's just you need to know what the right answer is. So there's different question styles throughout the exam. But again, as you've seen across the group of everyone's on the call today, pretty much question, you've got consensus. A comment from Sebastian. Actually, very good point, Sebastian. Yeah, the tricky bit here is option B is a result of A, not a direct benefit of asymmetric crypto. Yes, you have to look really clearly at the question. What is the benefit of asymmetric cryptography? B is it's there. Distractors are there for a reason. They are trying to give you something else to think about, but don't let that skew you from the right answer. So this is the type of technique you need to be thinking about when you read the question. Read it carefully and consider what the stem, which is the core of the question, is actually trying to ask you about. Is it a piece of knowledge? Is it a piece of application? But try and understand what that stem is saying, because that will help you significantly into getting the right answer for that question. So those were 3 questions out of the practice paper. There's another 40 questions available in the practice paper. If you go to webassessor.com/idpro, the first thing you need to do is create an account or a login on WebAssessor. Then you can register. You go to the section that says register for an exam and select the CIDPRO practice exam, and then take the practice exam paper. All of the questions in the practice exam were candidates for going on to the live papers. For various reasons, usually we had too many questions in a certain area. They weren't selected. Or we're trying to get a balance of easier, medium, more difficult questions. Some areas we had too many difficult questions, too many easy questions. So we've taken those and built the practice exam. When we did the final review of the practice exam, it's similarly balanced to the main papers. So it is as close as we can get without giving you a real live exam paper. So I'll just have a look at the question. Yeah, I took this, taking the CISP exam, told me to answer the question like a manager. This seems like it would be best to keep thinking like a technical resource. Yeah, a technical resource that has done some application. We're really not focusing on having the management view. We're really focused on, are you a practitioner of identity? And hopefully through the practice exam, you'll see that coming through very strongly. So just before I go to a few minutes of Q&A, there is a discount code for today. Gives you 10% off the CIDPRO exam. If you use the code CIDPRO_10, that will give you a discount off the full exam paper, and that expires at the end of March. If you have any questions at all about the exam, then please send it to certification@idpro.org. And we've already got a large number of FAQs documented, but if any questions that you can't find on the website, please drop them to this alias, and we'll get back to you with an answer as soon as possible. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for attending. And we've got time, Heather and Hannah, for a few questions. I've got one here from Dan. Can we share the slides? I think Heather, we're sharing the
Mhm.
slides and the recording, I believe.
We are indeed sharing the slides and the recording after the session is over and I get them uploaded and cleaned up.
They're nearly clean. There's a few tweaks.
Yeah.
But
We
yes,
also had
they'll be
another
available.
question early on that I wanted to touch on. So not only do I get to be the executive director for the organization, I'm also the principal editor for the body of knowledge, and I've been doing that for much longer than I've been running things. The question was, do we need to know where invitation and aspirations of upcoming body of knowledge articles that haven't been written yet? So the CIDPRO exam does rely quite a bit on the body of knowledge, but the body of knowledge doesn't exist for the exam. It's bigger than that, right? It has in its own way, a broader audience, such that there are areas that are absolutely going to go to in advanced topics, or very specific areas, or areas that might be speculative right now and therefore aren't appropriate for a foundational exam. If you're interested in knowing more about those and what we're trying to do, I do have what I call if I were queen of the universe, this is what the table of contents would look like for the body of knowledge. That's available in GitHub, github.com/idpros. We have a GitHub repository that includes what would the table look like, and it'll take us a little while to get there, but there's a lot of subjects that are indicated. We're still looking for people to write to.
In terms of the exam content, everything we've used is a published BOK article. We haven't used any that were not published at the time of writing the exam questions. We've got a couple of other questions. The certification to be ANSI accredited. Yes, we've discussed that. Heather, we discussed that very early on. I think the decision was we weren't going to do it straight away. But good point to raise it again. I need to have another look at that.
Yeah, it is definitely something we've been thinking about. Yeah.
So answer right now is no, but it is something we have been thinking about. Is there a plan to require recertification or renewal in the future? Not currently. As I said at the beginning, this exam is around foundational components of identity. Foundational exams tend to have core concepts that are long-lasting as their basis. And I'd say that's what you've got with the CIDPRO credential, is really solid foundational elements that have been around in identity now for substantial time and are likely to still be around. There's a lot of new areas developing, obviously. But what you've got in the foundational certificate is a recognition that you understand the essential principles of identity. So that's why early on we made the choice not to introduce recertification at this point. Obviously, as with any program, it could be introduced later. But at the moment, there's certainly not an intention to do that. Okay, any other questions? Heather or Hannah, I don't think I've missed anything.
No, I think you've covered everything.
Okay. So in which case, I'd like to say thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope that's been a helpful session. Most of the documentation I've referred to, obviously the guidelines, the objectives are on the CIDPRO website. The BOK articles are all available. Hopefully that list of specific articles to start from will really help with your preparation. But the main thing is don't be scared of the exam. If you know your identity and you're a 2-year practitioner, you should comfortably pass it. And a good number of people have passed this. So go into it with confidence. It's a good exam, and good luck, and hope you can pass it. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, everybody. And Heather, back to you. Any Anything to finish with, or I think we're done?
Absolutely. Well, first, thank you, Kevin. That was useful as always. I do want to thank everybody for coming. If you happen to be an CIDPRO member, I hope you regularly hang out on our Slack channel, our Slack environment. There is a certification channel, and one of the things some people have done in the past is set up study groups to work together, read through, quiz each other as one method for preparing for the exam. So if that's something you're interested in, by all means, use that environment. That's what it is for. If you're not an CIDPRO member, we know how to fix that. Just let me know. And with that, I will let you all go. And again, thank you so much for coming to this. It was great to have you here.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone.